Good morning, ladies and gents. We thank you very much for joining us for our June Launchpad lecture. I see some regular faces, some faces that left us for a little while, but then they came back. They told me a great story, by the way. And then I see lots of new faces, so I want to say welcome to our first Friday of the month Launchpad lecture. Growing up as a child, watching Reading Rainbow, you hear about the archaeologists and the archaeology and the studies and the things that they find and discover. And you automatically think, oh, this is some far off place, it's somewhere far away, it's exotic, oh my gosh. Well, today we have for you our very own local friendly neighborhood archaeologist who does this in our own backyard. So I'd like to ask everyone to join me in welcoming Dave Greenwald as he gives us a presentation regarding digging in our backyards.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, April. That was nice. April's been out to the site, so she has a good idea of what we're going to be talking about today. So when we talk, well, let me say a few things about Jornada Research first. We're a nonprofit organization. We do research. We look at archaeology, history, geomorphology and geology, the natural sciences in general, and we also do paleobotany studies and try to do reconstructive type studies, how the paleo environment looked like years ago. We also do ethnographic studies, ethnohistoric studies, and we deal with petroglyphs and pictographs, which we don't refer to as rock art. We refer to them as studies in symbolism and expressionism, because they probably had a much deeper meaning than just being art. We find them being kind of artsy, but they did have a specific meaning. So we have a conference coming up in July 7th, 8th, 9th, and then on the 10th, we're going to be here for all day. Conference is called Archaeoastronomy and Celestial Geometry, Understanding Ancient Astronomies, and it's going to be held in Ruidoso at the Convention Center. And we have 26 speakers who are coming from across the country, Mexico, the UK, and the EU to talk about the projects, their research, and share what they've been finding with us. This is open to the public. There's a registration fee for the conference, but we invite the public to come to our conferences. Our mission is all about engaging the public, and we want to make sure that we provide educational opportunities to the public, and the conferences are just one way we do that. You probably have seen advertisements at the Otero Arts Center, where we also do one lecture a month there, different topic each month, but I'll be speaking there again. It's always the third Tuesday of the month. So, okay, if we can bring the lights down a little bit more. When we think about archaeoastronomy and how ancient people examined the night skies, the calendars that they created as a result, we oftentimes think of the Mayan people. The Mayan people were masters at understanding the night sky and creating calendars, and because of their glyph system, they left a long history of information about the calendrical observations that they were making. I mean, they had a very, very accurate calendar, more accurate than our calendar. And so in the Mayan jungle, there's oftentimes, during the night, you would hear the sound of the big cats. feel like you're in the jungle. Anyway, my presentation has very little to do with cats, but rest assured that in prehistoric times, historic times, we had jaguars here. And the prehistoric people documented the presence of those. So we're going to talk about Creekside Village. We're also going to talk about some of the archaeology, other archaeology that's in Tularosa Canyon. I've been working with Adam Hoppus, you might find him down at the Chamber of Commerce, and we've been working on some of this AI, artificial intelligence, to create what we believe is a representation of Creekside Village, the Great Kiva, and how the Great Kiva and the houses there were spatially associated with where the fields were and the canals. And if you look right behind the Great Kiva, you can see a canal that's carrying water behind it, and then cornfields that are out on the floodplain. This is not exactly an accurate depiction of Creekside Village, but it gives you somewhat of an idea of what it might have looked like. We'll never know for sure what the Great Kiva looked like, because when we found it, it was just a depression in the ground. There was no standing walls or anything. But I've talked before quite a bit about Creekside Village and other sites in Tularosa Canyon, and I'm going to focus a little bit on the makeup of Creekside Village before I move into the archaeoastronomy to kind of set the stage. Creekside Village was occupied roughly between AD 600 and 900 and is part of the Masia phase of the Jornada Mogollon people. It was a permanently occupied village. These were rare. This is probably the first confirmed permanently occupied village in the Tularosa Basin at this time period. There are 5 residential wards. What I mean by residential ward is areas where the houses were located, and they were all up on elevated landforms that could not be used for agriculture because either they were too high above where they could get water to irrigate, or that they were just rocky soil areas, Pleistocene deposits that were otherwise had no purpose that they could use them for other than habitation. The irrigation systems diverted water from the Rio Tularosa into 2 canals. This is common throughout the canyon. Every one of the canal systems and settlement systems that I've looked at has 2 canals, one on the north side of the river and one on the south side of the river. They created floodplain fields, and they also built terraced agricultural fields, and those terraced fields lie above the level that they could irrigate with the water being diverted into the canals. So to do that, they created a reservoir. This is also at another site called the Twin Kiva site, where you find reservoir and these terraced agricultural fields. The Great Kiva itself was also used as an observatory. So an aerial image of Creekside Village consists of, let me see if I can do this. All right. There's 5 areas that are outlined in white. Those are the residential areas where the pit houses were. The Great Kiva is the orange area just to the north of that locus. We had a spring, artesian spring at the site that was active during the occupation. There's the reservoir. The main canal on the north side loops down. The green represents the main canal on the south side. This is all floodplain that would have been agricultural fields. So that's sort of the layout of Creekside Village from the air. It's an expansive area. It's probably about a total of 25 acres that's included in that particular image. So the pit houses, the houses where people lived, These are the largest pit houses that have ever been discovered in the Tularosa Basin. And as far as I know, the largest pit houses that have been discovered anywhere associated with the Jornada Mogollon people. Compared to the typical pit houses of this time period, the Mesilla phase, these are like anywhere from 5.5 to 6 times larger than any of the other pit houses. The one here on the right is, we call that a D-shaped pit house. It has one flat side, the rest of it is all rounded. It has the typical types of features we'd expect in a house: a central hearth, an ash pit, a deflector area. The entryway is off to the southeast in this particular case. Entryway goes off this direction. So this is the alignment of the hearth, deflector, and the entryway. And it is aligned to the southeast lunar maximum rise position. It also has a series of 4 post holes that supported the interior framework of the structure. There's 2 areas, one here and another here, that were large bell-shaped pits. They're narrow at the top and they bell out underground. They go down roughly 4 feet below the floor surface. These were used for storage. They put corn or squash or whatever in those pits and store it until they needed to eat it. There's other areas with that cluster of depressions up in this area. We think that was also storage, where they would have a depression in the floor to set pots in so the pots wouldn't tip over. So this was a habitation structure. We estimate that because of its size, it could have contained 10 or more people. The other structure, which is under excavation in this photograph, we now have all of the fill out of it down to the floor, and you can see all of the stains that we still have to excavate. We've excavated a few, including one bell-shaped pit, storage pit, and there's another one that we know of, and we suspect a third one. And this one is actually 44 square meters. It could have held 15 people. These are absolutely huge structures. So the family that lived in these would have been an extended family. So you'd have your mom and dad and a bunch of kids and grandpa and grandma, and then probably some unmarried siblings that were living together in one household. All right, so along the Rio Tularosa in the canyon, starting up, I'm assuming you might know where Bent is located. Near Bent, there's Round Mountain. That's a conical landform that is really easily recognized. It's got a cross on the top. But starting just west of Bent is an irrigation system we call the Twin Kiva system. It starts way up here, and then on both sides, you can see it tracks on down. Highway 70 does a lot of damage to it. It disappears on the south side because of development, but it continues on all the way down to there. That's the reservoir at Creekside Village. So the irrigation canal from the Twin Kiva site is delivering water to the reservoir at Creekside Village. That's very significant. That means that these people are interacting. They're not independent canal systems. They're relying on each other in order to meet their necessities. They're sharing in probably a water management system. I'll talk about that in another presentation. But as you go down the canyon, you'll see that there's of course the Creekside system, and then below that is the Germany Falls system, and then the Bridal Falls system. Each one of these systems, irrigation systems, are interconnected, and I've found direct evidence of that where the Creekside Village system links with the Germany Falls system. After we get past Germany Falls, it gets a little bit harder to see what's there because there's so much residential development in the canyon there. So let's talk about Kiva, the Great Kiva at Creekside Village, we have radiocarbon dates from the Great Kiva that tell us that it was at least used between 673 and 724 AD. It could have been built earlier than that because we have evidence that some of the posts were probably replaced over time. But we don't know how much earlier it might have been. This is one of the earliest Great Kivas in the Southwest. I think the earliest one dates to about 620 AD. It's definitely the first Great Kiva found in this area. So that makes it extremely important. Before we knew there were Great Kivas here, the common consensus was that these people did not have Great Kivas. They were highly mobile. They didn't live in villages. But now we have the Great Kiva not only here, but we have as many as perhaps 6 more we've identified in Tularosa Canyon alone. So it's a phenomenon that dates primarily to this Mesilla phase. Much later, they have what are like in a pueblo that we have right here in Alamogordo. We have 2 pueblos here that most people don't know about. One is near the junction of Highway 82 and Florida. The other one is down at the sort of the junction of Ocotillo and Scenic. Both of those were excavated in the late 20s and early 30s, and they each had one large rectangular or square room that was believed to be a community room or a community structure within the pueblo. So pueblos migrated, or Great Kivas migrated from being circular, large circular structures to below ground structures to above ground rectangular or square structures. Great Kivas are still used today among the pueblos in the northern Rio Grande, and they served as community structures for rituals, ceremonies, for governance and social and political uses, and sometimes to monitor astronomical events. And that's actually fairly common based on my research into some of the historic pueblos. This is a drawing, a plan view drawing of the Great Kiva. We've excavated half of it, so the bottom half has been excavated. The upper half is still under excavation, but we have identified certain key elements in it. But let's start with its location. It's located on the highest landform at the site. It's a ridge, and it's on the southeast side of that ridge. So it has a view of the eastern horizon, but not the western horizon. It was ritually abandoned. That's just common among Great Kivas. When they reached their end of their life, they would ritually burn them. They'd set them on fire and destroy them. But they'd make offerings to them. We know that this is not a domestic structure because it does not have features related to domestic activities. It doesn't have artifacts in it that suggest that they were processing food or cooking food. We have found a total of 2 artifacts on the floor of this Great Kiva. One is a bone tube, worked bone tube, and the other is a turquoise pendant. These are ritual objects that were deposited prior to the destruction of the Great Kiva. And it's oriented specifically to the winter solstice sunrise. So if you look in the center, you see the circle that's indicated by the H. Where'd it go? Right here, this is the central hearth. This is the entryway between the walls. The alignment to the winter solstice sunrise is right through the center of the entryway, and it aligns with a notch on the horizon where the sun comes up on the solstice. So in archaeology, archaeologists will use that kind of architectural association hearth, entryway, deflector, in order to determine the orientation of a structure or its focus, which direction it's focused. The Great Kiva also has a bench that completely encircles the structure, goes all the way around. We found it in the end of the trench there, comes all the way around, and then it's actually goes across the entryway. You step off of the bench to enter the Great Kiva, and then the upper wall that goes all the way around is made out of adobe. It's gypsum adobe, and that material was borrowed from the artesian spring that's at the site. This is a sacred place, the Great Kiva. It's a space that that the Hopi talk about quite a bit, the importance of their arrival here in this world. They call this their fourth world. From the third world, they migrated from under the ground, from beneath the surface, through a small, what some people have referred to as a cosmic tunnel, but in their terms, it's a sipapu. The sipapu is that entrance, that connecting entrance between the upper world and the lower world. And the Kiva represents that emerging area where people came from the underworld, emerged in the upper world, and it represents that to this day. They still use Kivas, and they still reflect on that association. So most of the Kivas that you will see at archaeological sites, even the ruins of archaeological sites, will have had ladder entryways. Our Great Kiva actually has a ground level entry, and they would have still needed an opening in the roof above where the hearth would be to allow the smoke to rise and exit the interior. For those Kivas that had ladder entryways, that entryway was also the smoke hole. And that particular opening allowed them to monitor the sky. And in particular, the Hopi were very closely tied to the constellation of Orion, or maybe the asterisms of the Orion's belt or his sword. And also the Pleiades. These were timing events, as they would watch them come into view while sitting in the Kiva, watch them come into view through that opening in the roof. And so as that happened, that would happen about early or mid-May, when they would see the constellation start to show up in the entryway, and then Orion would be visible all the way to November. This tied in very closely to their agricultural cycle. They can't plant too early. It's difficult to plant while there's still a threat. I'm sorry. While there's still a threat of frost, or if the ground is too cold for the seeds to germinate. So they're trying to time these particular events really closely, and so they create this sequence of events that are tied to astronomical events as well as to horizon calendars. The Hopi made great use of horizon calendars, and I'm going to talk about the one that we have here in the Tularosa area. So the Great Kiva basically represents what some think is the desert horizon or the image of the Earth. It has that circular feature about it. It's got a kind of a domed, but not too much of a domed roof. And then they were used in various ways as observatories. So the Great Kiva is really difficult to photograph because it's so large. So here we have about half of the southern half of the Great Kiva exposed, and it gives you an idea. It's not really deep, but here's the thing. You know, I mentioned it's located on the southeast slope of the ridge. And it's that particular area where they built it. It has all these cemented gravels and cobbles, Pleistocene deposits, and they had to dig through that to build this kiva here. And from the time that we found this particular depression in the ground, and we thought it might be a Great Kiva, we kept asking ourselves, why would they build it here when if you went 75 feet or 100 feet to the north, there's this really nice level area and the soils are easy to dig in, but no, they built it there. And so that made us think that there's a specific purpose. So it really does appear as though that this was a calculated and predetermined location. And what we discovered was that the central hearth becomes the common intersect point of both the winter solstice sunrise and the summer solstice sunrise. So they were probably calculating that particular position, and that's why it's built where it is rather than in some place where I would have built it because I'm too lazy to dig through all of the Pleistocene gravels and cobbles. But we also discovered, as we continued to do our investigations, that the two lunar maximum rise positions are also visible from the central hearth as well, and they're tied, both of those are tied to conical landforms. The northeastern lunar rise position is tied to Round Mountain. The other one, the southeastern rise position, is tied to another conical landform we call Islatano Peak, because just behind it is a canyon called Islatano Canyon. And that's where the Isleta people from down in the El Paso area came at one time and collected ponderosa pine beams to build their new church down there, and that's how it got its name. But each of these events, including the two lunar minor, I'll talk more about what's lunar major and lunar minor in a minute, but even the two lunar minor events are keyed into a specific, a unique landform on the horizon. And these we call horizon markers because they're easy to identify. So like the sunrises, the winter solstice and summer solstice, those both occur in notches on the horizon. The lunar maximum with conical landforms. The lunar minimums on another type of landform. I call them elbows because they're like this on the horizon. You'll see them in another photograph. Okay, so with our Great Kiva, they may have also monitored celestial activity through the smoke hole. But we have no proof of that. It's very difficult to make those kinds of determinations when your preserved wall heights are really low and you don't really understand exactly what the roof looked like. But in some of these other Pueblo sites, they still have roofs on some of these Great Kivas or clan Kivas, and so they have an idea of how they worked. If you come to the conference, we will have an individual who can talk about that all day long because he spent lots of time in southeastern Utah studying these exact events. So this is a photograph of our horizon. You can see that a lot of it is quite undulates. We have some flat areas on there. Couple of saddles. You can see the conical landform right here. That's tied to the southeast lunar maximum. And these lines that you see radiating up, those are the trajectory lines of the celestial object, the sun or the moon. That's the path they follow on these particular events, like the southeast lunar maximum. It follows that low curve across the sky. If you look in the, let's see, right here, this purple, it's kind of a purple color, violet color line, that's the winter solstice sunrise. And it follows a similar trajectory, but it gets the sun gets a little higher in the sky than the moon does. But across that entire horizon, there are various points that are keyed into very specific dates, and those dates are tied to certain things like when is the last frost in the spring, when's the first killing frost in the fall, where's the summer solstice, perhaps when is the time to plant. So all of those things are indicated here. This image is based on this program called Stellarium. You can load it on your cell phone and you can view the night sky. It's one of many that you can view the night sky. But you can do so much more with it too if you get the advanced one. You can actually go forward and backwards in time with it. We also use Peak Finder. Peak Finder helps us with the horizon, and another program called the Photographer's Ephemeris, and that particular program allows us to calculate rise events and the timing of them. You need to know elevation and distance and that sort of thing to calculate all this, but it is possible to make those kinds of estimations. So from the Creekside Great Kiva, they would have watched the sun's annual cycle from the southeasternmost position, the winter solstice sunrise, to the northeastmost position, the summer solstice rise, and then back again, a total of 1 year, the annual cycle of the sun. They would have also monitored the synodic cycle of the moon, 29.5 days, and then they monitored the nodal cycle of the moon. This is a period of 18.61 years, and I'll get into why they were doing this in a bit. First, I wanted to show you the actual events. Here's the winter solstice sunrise in the bottom of that big saddle that you've seen. Then we have the southeast lunar rise position in relationship to Islatano Peak. We just recorded this in June, on the summer solstice last year. And we have the summer solstice rise, and here you can see to the left of the sunrise, you can see Round Mountain quite easily. It doesn't show up in a lot of the horizon pictures because we're taking photographs in the dark. Anyway, this is at the farthest point on the horizon in a low notch. And then we got lucky on January 11th. That was a Sunday. We were out with our volunteers digging, and I had known in advance that we were going to have a lunar rise event, maximum northeastern rise event. And so we went to the Great Kiva, and from the central hearth, we actually watched the moon rise. And so you see the moon at this point is up a little bit. When it was just starting to crest the horizon, it was directly over the top of Round Mountain. The white thing on top of Round Mountain, that's the cross. You probably have recognized it on the highway as you're driving by. And then after a few minutes, the moon again is now almost fully up, and the left side of the moon is actually to the right of the top of Round Mountain. This whole rise event takes 4 minutes, so you got to be prepared in order to capture it. And unfortunately, I missed the very first photograph when it was just cresting. But this is a great sequence, even though it's daytime. I did this all with my cell phone, so I apologize for the quality of the images. All right, so here we're looking at the lunar trajectory and the lunar rise over Round Mountain again, but this is from the Great Kiva site. The Great Kiva, we named it that because it's twice as big as all the other Great Kivas in Tularosa Canyon. Like the Creekside Village Great Kiva, its floor area is about 89 square meters. We estimate the floor area of the Great Kiva at 200 square meters. So it's at least twice as big. And what's really important about the Great Kiva is it's not associated with any kind of other activities. It's just up there by itself. There's no village associated with it. It seems to be an administrative type building. It may be the place where they were doing such things as allocating water to the different settlements in the canyon so that everybody got a fair share of water for irrigating their fields. But from the center of the Great Kiva, we see the moon rising directly over the top of it during the southeast lunar rise event. Now remember, the Round Mountain is also the northeast lunar rise event horizon marker with the Creekside Great Kiva. So it really seems that these conical landforms are really important to the lunar rise events that are taking place and that are being observed. All right, so here's the $64,000 question. Why did people monitor celestial events? Well, to maintain their origin stories and track their heritage. So it was very important for people who did not have written records to maintain an oral history, pass those stories down from generation to generation. And monitoring celestial events may have helped them relay that kind of message. Also as a means of calendric measure, timekeeping for rituals and ceremonies. Rituals and ceremonies were very, very important to these people. You can consider a Great Kiva equivalent to a church, if you will, because this is where they would go and perform rituals and say thanks for the bounty and those types of things. They could also use they would also track the seasonal changes associated with their economic pursuits. If they were agriculturalists, they would really want to know when it is safe to plant and when they need to get the harvest done before the first killing frost. Because if you're raising squash and gourds and you don't have them out of the field before you get a killing frost, what happens to the squash and gourds? They turn to mush. They're no good for anything after that. So you want to make sure that you get your harvest done in time. Hard frost is really good for the corn, though, because it helps get the moisture out of the corn and it helps preserve the corn. It prevents it from molding when it's being stored, and I'll show you examples of this in a minute. Also, they would want to watch these celestial events or the horizon in order to predict weather patterns and precipitation. We know that here we get when we get them, the monsoon rains come in usually in July. Sometimes they start early in June, and then they usually end about mid-August, or maybe if we're lucky, they'll last till September. That's when we get them. This is an image from Santa Clara Pueblo, historic image. And let me see what you can see. Oh, you can see pretty good. Okay, so we have all these ears of corn. This looks like blue corn. And then you go, the white or maybe yellow corn. And what they do to help dry that corn is they would pull back the husks. And they would braid those husks like into corn ristras. And that, in this case, you can see by doing that, they actually stand them up. There's another one. Wow, where'd that go? You can see how they're off the ground, basically. Let air get underneath them to help dry out the kernels so that they don't mold. And they keep them on the cob, the kernels on the cob, long enough to get most of the moisture out. But let's see. I don't think there's any squash in that particular image. All right, let's talk about the synodic cycle of the moon, 29-day 29.5 day cycle of the moon. I've given these talks before, and people would come up to me and they say, I don't really understand what you're talking about with the moon. And, it's hard to describe, so I decided to create this. This is from February of this year. On February 8th, we had the moon in its northern maximum position. So that's over here. And so this is the movement over a 15-day period of where the moon rises over that horizon. And it'll look the same, different horizon, but the pattern will be basically the same over any horizon over this 15-day period. So you end up with the moon moving in small increments at the beginning, the first couple of days, as it starts moving in a southerly direction, and then it starts moving quite a bit faster across the horizon until it starts closing in again on its maximum southern position. So the crescent over here is its southern maximum position, as you can see over around Islatano Peak. And then it seems to kind of sit there for a little bit, moves back just a little bit as it proceeds back to the north again. So every 30 days the moon will travel from its maximum northern position to its maximum southern position and back again. So does that make sense? Now, on this, I did the lunar maximum intentionally because it's too crowded to do the same image using the lunar minimum. The lunar minimum is from this point to this point. So 9.3 years after this year, we will be at the lunar minimum position. And that means that the moon is doing all the same things. 15 days go from north to south, and then another about 15 days to go back to the north, but in a much narrower space. So this is all due to wobble of the Earth and how the, anyway, the wobble of the Earth, I'm forgetting my train of thought here. Why monitor the nodal cycle of the moon? What is so important about that? We all know that the moon affects the tides, right? You have a huge, what they call supermoon, you get really high tides. But it also affects ocean currents. And in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Peru is a major current that flows from west to east. The water rises out in the Pacific and it travels along the surface of the ocean, and it's warming up this whole time, and then as it gets to the coast it circulates back down. They call that the Southern Oscillation, and it takes a little over 3 years for the water, once it starts, say at the farthest western point, to travel across to where it goes back under and comes back up again. That's about a 3-year cycle. And over that period of time, the water is warmed up by radiant heat on the surface. The warmer the water it gets, the more moisture that goes into the atmosphere. If it doesn't get really warm, not too much moisture gets into the atmosphere. Lots of moisture in the atmosphere means high mountain downpours in the Andean mountains, and big floods across the Peruvian deserts. Low amounts of moisture means some rain in the mountains, not very much in the deserts. But the other thing that happens too is now that this moisture is aloft up in the atmosphere, it moves up the west coast of South America, along this west coast of Central America, up the west coast of Mexico until about it reaches the southern tip of Baja. At that point, it starts running into another air mass that comes from the Bering Strait or the Bering Sea, and that is a cold air mass. And when they merge, they start moving off to the northeast, and they cross northern Mexico, Arizona, come into New Mexico, and that's where we get our summer monsoons. that moisture moving into New Mexico is also amplified by moisture coming out of the Gulf of Mexico, not the Gulf of America, but Gulf of Mexico, and that moisture is added, and that then continues in a northeasterly trajectory, and that's where the farmers today in the Midwest get their moisture for irrigation. It's direct precipitation for their corn and soybeans. So it's a very important source of water to Midwestern farmers. Imagine how important it would have been to prehistoric people who had no other source of water except for maybe direct precipitation in the desert environment. It'd be really hard to raise agricultural crops if you didn't have a reliable water source. So people like the Hohokam, who lived in southern Arizona, became master irrigating farmers, building huge canal systems. What we have in Tularosa Canyon is sort of a mini system that you would see in the Hohokam area. And it's that size because it's limited by the amount of water we have, and it's limited by the amount of arable land that is available for farming. So over time, we would see these different events. We refer to them as El Nino and La Nina. So El Nino being wet years, La Nina being drought years. And we know that this affected not only prehistoric people, but the historic people, the Pueblo people, because we have ethnographic accounts from the late 1880s and throughout the early 1920s about how the Pueblo people would store a surplus of food to last them through these drought years. This surplus that they would store would be equivalent to about a 3 to 6 year supply of food in case you had a prolonged drought. This is well documented by the ethnographic people who were sent out by the Bureau of Ethnology, and they collected data on every one of the Pueblo groups here in New Mexico and Arizona about their customs and farming and even about astronomy. And they weren't necessarily aware of the data that they were gathering, how important it would be to what we're doing today in terms of looking at the relationship between archaeology and astronomy, the past. Maybe even we can call it ethnoastronomy because it deals with living peoples as well. But it would be important nonetheless. The Spanish, when they arrived to colonize New Mexico under Oñate, they moved into one of the pueblos, San Juan Pueblo, up by Española, and literally kicked the Pueblo people out of the Pueblo and moved in and took over, and they lived there. And they lived there for several years until, and this is what we found in historic records, until they consumed all of the surplus foods that the Pueblo people had saved up, a 6-year supply. And after that, after they consumed it and the Pueblo people refused to bring them more food that they demanded that they did, they decided to relocate to Santa Fe and occupied another Pueblo there. And so they lived on the supplies of the Pueblo people there. That was a very tough time for the Pueblo people because they were literally being stripped of everything that they needed to survive. They were taking the clothes off their backs, they were eating their food, they were occupying their houses. It was a very tough time for the Pueblo people. So, but we do have these accounts of what's happening historically. So we see that in prehistoric times they would also be probably storing up surpluses. These surpluses would be important in a couple of different ways. In case of drought, or these were very social people, and so what they did was if you had people who their crops didn't make it, they would freely give to them a share of the surplus so that they could continue to survive and live and maybe generate another crop for the next year. Or the people who they came in contact with who were the hunters, gatherers, collectors, if they were struggling with their economics. So we go back and we're going to ask the same question again. Why did people monitor celestial events? Well, we'll just summarize really quickly to say that that was to maintain their origins and their heritage as a means of calendric measure, keeping track of time, especially for rituals. Rituals are so important to them. And after the harvest was over, rituals would be conducted during that period of time after the final frost, or after the killing frost, through the winter solstice, and then again back to probably about the 1st of February. Those were the times when many of the ceremonies and rituals were conducted. They would use celestial observation to track the seasonal changes associated with their specific economic pursuits and to predict weather patterns such as precipitation. They may have also been able to predict such things as eclipses. And just to show you where the most common time period for eclipses would occur, oh, I can't see it here. It's behind this, but it's basically between the time period of the lunar minimum on the map here on the image, between there and near the eclipse time in the year. That's where the sun and the moon are going to cross each other more commonly than other times of the year. Okay. We're almost done. So we've talked about Creekside Village as an agricultural community, mentioned a little bit about the rest of the agricultural communities in the Rio Tularosa or in the Tularosa Canyon, the significance of kivas to Pueblo people and their functions, touched on how kivas would have been used in various ways, but in particular, some researchers believe that almost every kiva, whether it was a clan kiva or a great kiva, was used for astronomical observations. We also talked about how horizons were used as calendars, and there's some great examples in the Hopi literature about their horizon calendars. The Hopis oftentimes use the Sacramento Mountains near Flagstaff, if you're familiar with that area, because it has lots of undulations as well, and it's easy to keep track of time using that. There's also various celestial events that were observed. You know, one thing I didn't touch on is Venus rises within the horizon range that we see in our images here, and every 8 years Venus returns to its southernmost rise position. It's quite likely that they were monitoring that as well. But unfortunately, there's not a horizon marker that marks that location. So we don't know for sure if they were monitoring or not, but most likely they were. And then agricultural cycles and where moisture originates. These are very important things to consider when you're talking about prehistoric societies. So I'd like to just say thank you and acknowledge the following people. John Groh has been helping me with the graphics in here. He's also my co-author on a number of things. Jim Crable, he's an artist, archaeologist, and a paleoastronomer. He'll be at the conference. Really interesting guy to talk to. George Zotti is the designer of the Stellarium plugin. And he has been at our disposal because I am not an astronomer, I'm an archaeologist, and I had to learn all this stuff when we discovered we had this particular Great Kiva that served as an observatory. Stephen Trainer, also very helpful with the application of photographers ephemeris. And then I like to mention H.D. Lawrence because he's always a good read. So I'll take questions if anybody would care to throw one at me. I can't see real good. Can we bring the house lights up maybe? Anybody got their hand up? Oh, there's one.
Dave, you said this is an agricultural society. Did they also have a source for meat, or were they vegetarians, or do you know?
That's a good question. The Maciaphase people of the Jornada Mogollon were well known for eating lots of rabbits. In the pit houses that have been dug at all these other sites, the small pit houses, rabbit mandibles are the one thing that seems to survive because they're not stripping the meat off the bone. They're crushing the bone and the meat and everything, throwing it all in the same pot. But the mandible with the teeth, they would discard that. And so rabbits probably made up about 40% of their meat protein. But at Creekside Village, they were really focused on agriculture. And we have no rabbit mandibles to account for. And we only have a very, very small representation of faunal remains. And so they were focused on getting, their nutrient requirements from like corn, beans, and squash. And so, yeah, they weren't big hunters, but if they ran into a rabbit in their fields, they probably would kill it and then, quickly cook it and eat it for lunch. That was their version of fast food. You set me up so well for that. Any other questions?
So how do you store squash for 6 years?
Oh, well, squash is hard to store for 6 years, but we've stored it for over a year in our pantry. My grandparents had a potato cellar, and they would grow squash, and they would bury squash in sand in the potato cellar, and it would stay good for an entire year. So you can store it for at least a year, but the seeds are good for much longer than that. And you can actually do things with the seeds and eat the seeds of the squash or the gourds. So that even after the meat of the squash is probably no longer good, the seeds are still good inside them for quite a while. Anything else?
Do you know what kind of beans they were growing?
Beans are really difficult to find in the archaeological record. They don't preserve really well unless they've been charred. And then when they've been charred, they're hard to identify. But there is it's like Mexican taper type bean, a red bean. Some people call them Anasazi beans. That does show up. Beans would oftentimes be eaten green. They ate a lot of green corn too. As soon as the corn was ready, like we would, for example, take roasting ears and keep the husks on, put them on our barbecue grill and cook them on the grill, and they sort of steam roast themselves. They would do the same thing. They'd leave the husks on, they'd build a fire, let it die down to coals, put a bunch of ears of corn on, cover it up for at least a couple hours, and it would roast in there, and then they would uncover it, and they would peel off the husks, and they would eat the corn. It'd be very much like our sweet corn at that point in time.
What was their life expectancy?
Somebody who was 40 years old was probably considered pretty old. There were people that would live into their 60s, but probably the average was somewhere under 40. Yeah. They had a high infant mortality rate too. So.
In many cultures, it's kind of well known that a big wig of the temple or the kiva or the whatnot would be buried on site or near as some sort of honor. Have you come across anything of that sort with any of the kivas you've excavated?
I don't recall finding anybody in a kiva, and I've been doing this for 50 some years, and I don't recall finding anybody in a kiva. We find them in houses occasionally, but one example from Arizona, east of Flagstaff, there's a site there called Ridge Ruin, and under the floor of one of the houses was certainly a very important person that was buried there. This individual, the preservation was incredible, but still had lots of paint on the body. Was wearing some kind of clothing that was ordained or ornamented with lots of seashells, just tons of seashells. There were all kinds of like staffs and painted sticks and things like that. There might have been like what we would refer to as calendar sticks or pahos, prayer sticks, baskets that were painted, and the paint was still on the basket. It was an incredible discovery back in the 1940s, and all of that's on, well, it's not on display, but it's housed at the Museum of Northern Arizona. And they believe that this individual was probably someone who was traveling maybe as far south as Mexico, but back and forth from the south to the north, bringing and exchanging goods. So somebody of ranking position, but not necessarily somebody who belonged to that village. Here we would have an individual who would be like, for lack of a better term, the sky watcher. His job was really only to watch the sky. So the rest of the community fed him, provided him with food and stuff, and probably had his own house someplace nearby, but he wasn't living in the Great Kiva. There's no evidence that anybody lived in the Great Kiva. But he was there to watch the sky a lot of the time. You know, the Hopi and the Zuni have designated sun watchers, they call them, and they have a position. Every morning they have to watch where the sun rises and record where it rises. Or in some cases, if they're watching the western horizon, they have to watch the sunset and record where it sets, to keep track of time on a daily basis. And so that's a full-time job for people to do that sort of thing, and also to monitor other like celestial events. So yes.
That brings me to my question. Is I was going to ask, how did they document the sightings and or the situations that they observed for historic purpose?
Well, from some of the ethnographic work that was done among the Isleta people up by Albuquerque, Elsie Clues Parsons, she's like the grande dame of ethnographic people who spent time with probably 14 of the pueblos. She documented some very specific details about the sun watcher, and the sun watcher had like 2 proteges that were in training kind of thing when she was doing this. And they had a specific room. It wasn't necessarily a kiva, but it was a specific room that was designed so the upper walls would have slots in the walls. And on a specific day, let's say the summer solstice, for example, the sun would get into a position and the light would shine across the room. So they're sitting with their backs to the east, watching the sunlight as it comes through. And they had markings. Sometimes they were just painted designs, but they were call them targets. So the target for the Summer solstice would be certain design. Maybe it's just a line, but that ray of light would then strike it on that particular day. And so that's how they kept track of certain things such as that, those events. So there'd be multiple openings in walls that were tied to specific celestial events. We have a presenter at the conference who's coming from Arizona who's going to talk about the Casa Grande, the multi-storied adobe structure near Florence, Arizona, and Coolidge. And it has these portals that are in the wall, and some of those portals were used to monitor certain celestial events, and he's going to be talking about that. So they've known about this for a long time, but there's always more research that gets done and new information that is provided. So that'll be a good talk too. So.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Well, I've got a million, but I would definitely have to talk with you because these were great questions, which sparks more questions. So I'm going to chip his ear later. All right.
So I only went like 10 minutes over. Thank you.